Hey friends, as you might have noticed, I've recently advertised a few products on the basis that they'd make great holiday gifts for your nearest and dearest. But how about treating yourself to a little gift this year? If you're here, I'm guessing you love listening to great stories, so for this episode, I'm partnering with Audible to bring you even more of the content you love. Audible is home to the most riveting stories, some of which are narrated by big names like Kevin Hart, Kerry Washington, or Ethan Hawke. There is also a huge selection of genres to choose from, including celebrity memoirs, wellness books, and business guides. But take it from me, the selection of superbly narrated, masterfully written horror stories are what keeps me renewing my subscription. Audible members can choose one free title a month to keep forever, meaning the membership fees basically pay for themselves, and the platform serves as a great way to discover your new favorite authors and stories. Obviously, an Audible membership would make a great gift for someone this holiday season, but when it comes to those long holiday journeys and woozy hungover mornings, nothing takes the edge off like a good story. All you have to do is head over to audible.com/letsreadyt or text Let's Read YT to 500 and you can get a free 30-day trial, and I know for a fact that Audible will be the right fit for you. This is a story that I have only told my wife about and the guys who served with me at the time it happened. Just for future reference, audience, if you ever come across someone who's been in the military and they are always talking about war battles and combat, they're lying. You don't really talk about those things with civilians. Maybe close family, a spouse, but mainly you only talk to the guys you serve with about it, if at all, really. I won't give every single solid detail as far as the city and exactly where, but you'll get enough. So here I was, a college dropout, just turned 20 years old, only been in the Marine Corps for about 18 months, and I was already 4 months deep into my first combat deployment in Iraq. My job? 0331 Infantry Machine Gunner. We were doing weapons cache sweep along the Euphrates River because Al-Qaeda likes to store weapons along the banks and coasts of rivers. We're on the patrol, metal detector in hand, sweeping for weapons caches while also providing security when the metal detector goes off. The Marine holding it stops, sways around the area until the metal detector starts beeping crazy. So, all of us junior Marines, meaning it's our first deployment and we have to do all the nonsensical work, we start digging. Except me, of course. Being a machine gunner on patrol with a 240 Golf machine gun, I had to provide security. But I was right there. Marines start digging and digging until they hear a ding. Jackpot. We all thought at first, but as they kept digging, it was only a metal rod about 4 feet long. Dang. But another Marine was still digging until we came upon a piece of cloth. He tried to pull the cloth up, but it wouldn't budge, so other Marines around him started digging too, until they finally dig up a dead corpse. Not just any dead corpse, but the corpse of someone who had been tortured and mutilated for God knows what reason. His robe had bloodstains all over it. His hands were tied behind his back and his feet were tied together. Someone had obviously killed him and buried him there. We asked the locals around, but nobody would tell us anything. Not surprised at all by that, but the thing that always amazed me and still piques my interest till this day was the state of the corpse. Although his robe still had blood all over it and his hands and feet were tied together with rope, it was all bones, pure skeleton. Not a piece of flesh remained on him, but yet the rope that was used to tie his hands and feet together still remained on his skeleton along with his robe. I don't know much about decomposing bodies and how it works, but it still boggles my mind to this day. I went to a summer camp near Kelowna, British Columbia called Camp Oasis. It was about 2 kilometers down the road around the Okanagan Lake from a mental institution. The counselors there scared us all by playing a prank on us and saying that one of the patients, named Old Man Jenkins, had recently escaped and that he had murdered 3 kids but pled insanity and so didn't have to go to jail. So yeah, the camp week started off all right. I was 7 or 8, and we did a bunch of the regular summertime activities: canoeing, hiking, singing, sports, eating, crafts, all that stuff. It was technically an Anglican camp too, although not many kids there were actually religious, so we spent about half an hour a day doing Bible stuff too, everyone's least favorite part for sure. I was in a cabin with 4 other kids, all of whom were older than me. I was pretty easy to pick on when I was young, so I still got picked on then, but I was having a good time regardless. A great time, actually, one of the best few days I can remember. But one thing that made everyone uneasy, even the counselors, was the cabin at the far end of the field. Unlike all the other cabins which were clustered together around the main buildings in the lake, this one seemed small off in the distance, built into the forest hillside. But somehow at night, its figures seemed to grow larger with the shadows of the tall pine trees. Nobody was allowed to go on the other half of the field. I'd seen a kid get kicked out who went there for fun earlier that week. Nobody had camped in that cabin for around 10 years, but nobody really knew why, just that it was forbidden. Now, about midweek, I came back to the cabin at noon to get my bathing suit to find that my teddy was gone. It comforted me, I won't deny it. I mean, like I said, I was about 8 years old. I started to panic a bit since I'd had it since I was an infant, and it was almost like a friend to me. I figured one of the other kids had taken it, so when everyone got back at night, I asked about it. They teased me a bit, but nobody admitted to anything. I asked my counselor if he had seen it. He said no. The next few days I was pretty upset and I could hardly sleep at night. Eventually, during crafts, one of the kids in the cabin told me that he saw a kid from another cabin take my teddy bear, but he didn't know where he put it. At dinner, I confronted him. He laughed and said that he had put it in the cabin at the end of the field. At first, my reaction was to just go get it, but I didn't want to be kicked out. This was an expensive camp, and my parents were gone to the States for the week, so I'd have to get a relative to come all the way from Van to Kelowna to get me, so I couldn't do that. I told him to go get it, or else. In other words, an empty threat. I eventually ended up mentioning to a counselor that someone had taken it and put it in the cabin, but even he wasn't allowed to go there. I thought of telling on the kid and getting him kicked out, but thought better of it. I wanted to have at least a couple of friends out of this and not be seen as a rat. But I needed the teddy. There was no way I was leaving the camp without it. So I decided that I'd wait until night when all the counselors were asleep and I'd go there myself and get it. So that night, I went outside at about 2 a.m., doing my best not to crunch on the gravel and stay near the edge of the forest. The moon was extremely bright that night, so it was light enough to see where I was going, but there were clouds that occasionally obscured it, so it was intermittent. At the edge of the field, I hesitated, knowing that I could be kicked out, and I was also a bit scared, to be honest. But I figured that I was already in enough trouble for being out at 2 a.m. anyways, and I really needed this teddy. So I went on, keeping my footsteps slow and quiet. The cabin was even further away than it had seemed during the day. By this point, I was hyper-aware and had adrenaline pumping through me, on the watch for anyone or anything unusual. I tried the front door. Locked. How had this kid gotten in here? I walked around the back and saw a window that had once had a glass pane but was now empty. I wasn't tall enough, so I stacked some rocks and climbed through. The cabin was pitch black, but for the moonlight coming through the front door, I was soiling myself. I felt near the front door for a light switch, and I found one, but there was no electricity. This was an all-wood cabin, but I could smell a bit of rotten wood, probably from the rainwater coming through the window. But to me, that smell could have been anything. I had brought a stick from outside, as if though I could defend myself with it. This cabin, unlike the others, was 2 stories. After feeling around on the floor for a while for my teddy, I concluded that it wasn't there, so I headed upstairs. There was more light up there due to a window that ran the length of the wall and almost went floor to ceiling. My footsteps creaked as I looked around the unmade bunk beds, and my heart was pounding in my ears and I was trying my best to breathe slowly and quietly, gripping my stick very tightly. And then I saw it. My teddy, lying on one of the top bunks near the window. I climbed the ladder, grabbed it, and jumped down. As soon as I landed, I heard something, like someone breathing really hard out of their nose, similar to when you sprint and come to a stop and try to collect your breath as quietly as possible. I spun around, startled, and fell to the floor. I couldn't see very much in the gloom, but I couldn't make out anything. I got up, trembling, clutching the bear in one hand and stick in another. This is also the first time I ever swore. I remember hearing my parents and older friends say the F word, so I said it. F you, Jason, the name of the kid who allegedly put my teddy there. I kept saying it over and over for making me come out here like this. Just what a jerk. F you, Jason. I kept saying it as I walked back downstairs, as I went to the windows, pulled myself up, and jumped out into the forest. F you, Jason, I muttered, looking at the ground. F you, Jason. F you. I looked back at the cabin from the side. The front door was now open, hanging ajar, but it hadn't been when I got there. I turned around to leave, facing back towards the field, and that's when I saw it. A single dark figure, standing just off to the side near a tree. It let out a low moan and started speed walking towards me. I didn't even hesitate. I raced out of there. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. I ran for the field, trying to scream, trying to alert someone. I couldn't breathe. All I could hear was this man behind me mumbling, "Come here, kid." And at one point, I felt the warmness on my neck again. I could hear his footsteps. I kept trying to yell help all the way back to the cabin cluster, but sometimes you're too scared for words. And when I got back to the cabin, I opened the door, ran in, and slammed it shut behind me. No more footsteps. Everyone was awake now, asking me what was going on. I was crying and red-faced, unable to speak. I jumped up to my bed and looked through the window, and I could just barely see the face of the man running back into the forest. The next day, the camp counselors called my relatives from Van to come get me, as I was too upset to leave my bed and couldn't stop trembling and holding my teddy. I've never been back since, but I heard that while Old Man Jenkins was just a story, someone did actually go missing from that mental institution that week and didn't return. The counselors found nothing in that cabin when I told them except a bunch of rags that hadn't been there before, and some needles. Something happened last summer that has left me with many questions and few answers. I was employed at an appliance and furniture rental and sales business in Great Bend, Kansas. One morning, a coworker and I opened the store, and when we arrived, we noticed that the back door was left open. When we entered the back door, all the lights in the store had been turned on. It didn't look like a break-in because the security latch was intact. The security system had somehow been disabled because there was no power indicator on the code box. We immediately called the police and the store manager to report the situation. We were told not to open the store and to remain in the back office until someone arrived. A few minutes later, after hanging up the phone with the store manager, a police officer was knocking on the back door. I let them in and told them what we had found when we arrived. The officer started to walk through the back room and into the showroom when we started to hear a baby cry. I thought that a customer may have somehow entered the store and that they had a baby with them, so my coworker and I followed the officer in the direction of the crying baby. And well, I didn't believe what I was seeing. There were two babies lying on a twin-sized bed display. The officer told us to stay there while he checked the rest of the store. He had also radioed for another police officer to come to the location. I looked down at the babies, who were both tightly wrapped in dark green cloth. Both babies were quiet, very still, and looking at me and my coworker. I was taken aback by their odd eyes, as both babies had these large pupils that were just almost black. There were no irises or any indication of color in either of their eyes. The police officer was soon back with us, and he commented on the baby's eyes as well. In fact, he was totally freaked out, so much so that he even looked scared. The store manager soon arrived, as well as a senior police officer, and we all stood around the bed looking at these strange babies who laid there quietly watching us. The store manager pulled my coworker and I to the side and told us to go ahead and leave. He was not opening the store until we found out what was going on. We quickly headed toward the back door and left. I wasn't scheduled to work until a couple of days later, but I had talked to a few coworkers who said that the atmosphere in the store was very strange. They had been receiving weird telephone calls, and the security system alarm would trip on several times during the day. I got to work a little early for my next scheduled shift, and when I arrived, the store manager was sitting in the office, so I asked him what had happened after we had left. He said that two young women, who said that they were from the municipal court, eventually showed up and took the babies. The senior police officer told him later that he had no idea who the women were, but that he was told by a superior not to impede. He thought that they were probably from McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita. He also said that the babies were very quiet and seemed relaxed the entire period that they were there. I stopped working there not long after, and things were just never the same, and it got tougher each day. Essentially, when odd-looking people would come into the store and just walk around. After a while, I felt like I just had to get out of there. I'm not sure why, but it just didn't feel comfortable being there. It started out as a nice day in 1973. Mom was paying 50 cents for a small quart-sized bucket of black raspberries, so I had recruited two of the other kids in the neighborhood, Dwight Vanover and Tim Mitchell, to help pick. We had been picking in a field about 300 yards in the back of the house for probably a couple of hours. The field we were picking in might have been a cleared field at one time, but now it hosted huge berry bushes, and a ton of small brush, like trees, could be found sticking up about 10 or 15 feet. These were all small trees, though, with the larger, older ones along an old, fallen-over fence row that bordered the field. We were actually out beyond my folks' backyard to the side of another mowed yard. To get out there, we had walked about halfway down the neighbor's backyard, then cut over the fence and gone a couple of 100 feet out into the field to get to the best bushes. We had already each filled our buckets at least once and were trying desperately to fill them once more before sunset. As far as Mom knew, I wanted the money to go buy a pop at the Lawson store downtown, but I was really planning on going to the liquor store and buying a pack of cigarettes. I knew they'd let me buy them because I had done it for my dad in the past. They didn't even bother to take the note that Dad had given me to give them, so I still had it and planned to use it again. The sky had darkened quite a bit, but we were determined to get that last bucket done. I was farthest out in the field toward the center when I saw something strange in front of me. It was a silver ball, but I have no idea how big it was. It could have been hundreds of feet or inches across, or it could have been the size of a baseball. I really didn't know. If it hadn't been moving, I might not even have seen it there amongst the weeds, but it began moving in a very strange pattern. From where I was standing, it looked exactly like it was bouncing along the top of the berry bushes from left to right. I remember thinking at the time, and still remembering it that way today, as being like the little bouncing ball that used to appear on the television, when there were words for a song shown and it was going in time with the music. I didn't know what it was, but I had thought maybe it was a ball that had been thrown, or perhaps a frisbee on its side glancing off objects. But we were out in the field away from anyone else, and in that direction there was nothing but more berry bushes, trees, and fields. Although there are buildings in that direction now, at that time there weren't. I called the rest of the guys over and told them about what I had seen. Tim was skeptical and made a few wisecracks about me wearing glasses, but Dwight made me go over every detail. He wanted to know what it was and even started to go that way even though the bush was very thick and he literally had to make a path. I would have already gone that way further to get berries, but the way was blocked, and Dwight was a tough one and began pushing his way through. It was really getting dark by now, and a beautiful red sunset began to spread out among the clouds. Dwight was still pressing into the bushes and hadn't gone very far when we began to hear a sound. There was the sound of something coming through the weeds at us, and it sounded heavy and quiet at the same time. There was just the sound of berry branches being crushed and occasionally a popping or snapping as a small tree would go over. The bushes around us were tall, taller than us, and we couldn't really see what was going on or what direction it was coming from. But one thing we knew for sure, it was getting a lot louder. It had increased in volume so quickly and so much that I yelled to everyone to run, and we all ran as fast as we could to the tree line that marked the edge of the field. I remember we all burst out of the weeds at about the same time. It was a relief to be standing on mowed grass even though we were still so far from the house. And then we heard it again. It was still coming our way, and By that time, we were all very scared. Everyone took off running again, with me being in the back. We only had to go about 50 feet to get to the edge of my folks' backyard, but it was getting darker by the second. Tim was still in the front of me, but I think Dwight veered off to go around the other side of the house to make a sprint for his house across the street, while Tim and I tried going for the front door of my house. Tim and I were still carrying the buckets that we had been collecting berries in, but as I reached the corner of our backyard, Tim stopped and turned back towards me. I know I felt good about that, I can recall, because he could have kept going, but he didn't. When he caught sight of me, I caught his eye, but then the woodpile next to me started making sounds. Mostly there were branches that had been thrown there over a period of time. Some were small, others were a couple of inches in diameter. In all, the pile was about chest high to me and had settled, becoming denser over time. As soon as the noises started, Tim dropped his bucket and took off running, but I hesitated. This was my yard. Surely it wouldn't come into my yard. The woodpile had made some loud cracking noises, and that's when I saw it. I've never seen anything like it before or since. I have seen things that remind me of it though, and every time, I'm thrown back even now to the gulf of 50 years to look once again at it. If it had hair, it was in coils atop its head, and being in the glare of the sunset with the sun going down behind it, the thing looked for all the world to have an exposed brain. The convolution of its head was all highlighted in red, while most everything else was shadowed to black. Its eyes were strange and seemed eyeless and overlapped with something like goggles over them. Those I could only see highlights of, as most of it was totally hidden in a shadow. Of its mouth in that area I couldn't see anything, but lower down I could see an extremely thin neck. It looked segmented, like a flexible conduit pipe, and tinted the ruddy red of the setting sun. Once it came up above the woodpile, I got one solid look, but it was fast. It had stuck its head up so fast, and it was there at least a second before I dropped my bucket and took off running after Tim. So great was my fright at that point that I caught up and almost passed him as we came up to the side of the house. Mom was in the kitchen as we came bursting through the door, but didn't scold us when she saw the fright on our faces. Right away, she called the Vanovers to see that Dwight had made it safely home. After we all calmed down, Tim insisted that he was okay to ride his blue Stingray down the street to his house if Mom and I would come out and watch him ride home. Our road did have streetlights, so we could see him pedaling home as fast as he could. Then later we talked on the phone for a while. The next day, my dad called me back to the woodpile. There was my berry bucket where I had dropped it, but it was the woodpile he wanted to show me. The pile was almost broken in two, with both sides looking as though they had been grasped and ripped apart. My dad gave me one of those weird looks and asked if I was sure I didn't do that, but at the look on my face, he just left it be. My dog was also in the backyard at the time. I don't remember hearing her bark the whole time that we were out there, although she wasn't one of those barking dogs, really. And needless to say, I was careful to feed the dog in the daytime for quite a while. What happened to me sent me down a path. One thing to consider, when we were out in the field, it was light enough to see to pick berries. However, at the dead run for young boys, after about maybe 300 or 400 feet from where we were picking to the corner of the backyard, it became the last vestiges of sunset. It wasn't until years later that I considered it and actually sat outside and waited between the two. I came up with a 20-minute lapse of time. So there is also a missing time element there too. I didn't write this up until many years later, but it haunts my dreams. A while later, Mansfield, Ohio was hit with a huge UFO flap. Something else was in the description of the thing. It was the speed of it popping up in the woodpile. Once, many years later, I was watching Star Wars when they were trapped in the garbage thing and the head of that worm thing popped up. Although the head was different, I had an immediate flashback. The head was overly large for the neck, and the sunset was behind it, causing it to have red light all around it. Because I only looked long enough to register what it was, I only caught a glimpse of a head that had corrugations on top. Something like the convolutes of the brain, or perhaps dreadlocks with red light shining down on it. And for a very young boy, it's been the thing of nightmares for around 50 years. I just felt that it was time to tell this. These are two accounts of the most scared I've ever been. Both happened while I was stationed in Afghanistan. The first happened in late 2011 in a place called Helmand Province, Afghanistan. I was standing post on a small 8-man patrol base at about 2 a.m. in the morning. The post consisted of 4 plywood walls, bulletproof glass, and multiple sandbags. I had been up for about 24 hours at this point and was starting to hallucinate through my NVGs, mildly seeing school buses and the like, when all of a sudden, bang. I first thought it was a round hitting the bulletproof glass, realized about a second later that it was a rock. Immediately on high alert, adrenaline flowing, I scanned the area with mini thermals and get no heat signatures from anywhere. The strange part was that we had double-stacked razor wire about 30 meters out from the post, and it was all open ground for about 30 meters past that, so any rock throw would have had to have been amazing. I called up to the center of command and had them use a big thermal camera on a stick to scan the area in case I missed something. They got nothing. At this point, I'm kind of freaking out, thinking that there's someone out there that I can't see, but they can see me. 10 or 15 minutes go by and I'm starting to relax a little bit, thinking maybe a bird flew into the glass or something like that. All of a sudden, bang. Now this time, it sounded 2 times louder. I get a feeling of pure terror and feel adrenaline flush through my body. I've got my rifle at the ready, PEQ laser on, looking harder than I've ever looked before at every piece of micro-terrain that a human could be hiding behind, and still, I can't see anything. I freak out, but nothing happens for the rest of the post. I still do not know to this day what it was, but it scared the life out of me. I'm thinking it might have been some form of hallucination, but it felt too real. I know that probably doesn't make sense, but it just kind of didn't feel like something my brain was making up. Now, the second story happened in early 2012. We were still in Helmand Province, but a different, bigger patrol base, 13-man plus Afghan National Army platoon. It was around midnight on this post. The patrol base had gravel lining the whole grounds to keep dust down. It was a poorly built defensive position with blind spots everywhere. I was a little over 6 hours into an 8-hour shift when I heard some gravel crunching just below my post, which is about 10 feet back inside the wire, i.e. the blind spot. Very unusual because we had an early AM patrol and everyone but myself, the other post stander, and the one guy on radio watch in the command center were sleeping. I call out, "Who's that?" And the crunching stops and I get no response. I use my radio to call the command center and ask if he was walking about. He tells me no, so I ask him to come check this out. I make sure to tell him to be careful coming around the corner and have him keep his rifle up, weapon light on, and pop the corner. As I see him walking out of the COC, the gravel crunching sound picks up again, but this time rapidly like someone was running. Once again, high alert adrenaline flowing hardcore. I'm thinking we've got someone inside the wires, so I start yelling, "Stop or I'll shoot," in Afghan. The sound stops, and my radio watch pops the corner ready to shoot, and nothing. There was just nothing there. So once again, I'm freaked out. He chalks it up to me being paranoid and lacking sleep, but I'm not so sure. About an hour later, it happens again, almost exactly the same way with nothing being there once more. I have the radio watch, I wake up my buddy, and he stands on post with me for the last hour, which passes without incident. I still have no clue what it was. A kid inside the wire somehow? A cat? A dog? A ghost? Who knows? All I know is I have never been more scared than those 2 incidents. In my early 20s, I went through a wandering stage. I had just graduated from college and couldn't find a job anywhere. Rather than go a couple of $100s into the hole every month paying for rent while searching for a job, I decided to pack up what few belongings I owned and headed out to see the country. And this is something I can't recommend enough. Stay off the interstates, hop a train from time to time, and hitchhike with no particular destination in mind. It was this kind of aimless wandering that led me to the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. If you've never experienced them, the Barrens are an amazing place. Huge stands of oak and evergreen trees, many older than time itself, grow out of that strange, sickly soil. Sugar sand, the locals call it. In the rainy season, it forms quicksand, and in the dry season, it can still swallow farm machinery whole. Of the few farms I saw out there, all looked like they had seen better times, and many looked like they had sat untouched for decades. Yet there was something alluring about the place, a sort of ancient secret I was afforded glimpses of in the shadows when the wind stirred the trees. The sort of movement at the edge of your vision that follows you throughout the day but disappears as soon as you turn your head. From time to time, as I hiked down old dusty roads, an old pickup truck or rusted-out car would bound over a hill toward me. Most times the driver would eye me suspiciously and speed up as they approached. Occasionally the driver would stop to talk to me for a few minutes. "What are you doing out here?" one old toothless man clad in overalls asked me. "Wandering around, seeing what there is to see," I replied. The old man spat a putrid brown stream into the dust. "Tain't nothing to see around here, at least nothing you want to be seeing." When I asked the old man what that meant, he made a guttural, throaty sound. I wasn't sure if he was choking on his tobacco or bothered by the question, but he didn't answer. He offered me a ride in his pickup the way that I had come back into town, but when I declined, he spat in the dirt again and sped off, shaking his head. My eventual plan was to make it to Delaware sometime that summer and meet up with some extended family there, but I was in no hurry. In truth, I had been in heaven these last few weeks, taking my time heading south and exploring anything that caught my eye. I had explored every abandoned building and every cave I had seen. I had half my weight in power bars in my pack, but over the last 2 months I had honed my skills at trapping rabbits and gathering wild edibles, sitting up late at night beside my campfire and sleeping beneath the stars. The night sky in an area so devoid of human influence is beyond comprehension. But tonight there were clouds moving in, and the sun was disappearing faster than I had grown accustomed to. When the deep roar of thunder shook the valley, I knew that I had better find shelter. In the failing sunlight, I could see in the distance some structures at the top of a hill. I ran the half-mile distance and was disappointed to see that the ancient house and barn were in terrible shape. The roof of the barn had completely collapsed, and the upper 2 floors of the 3-story house had collapsed into a mangle of ancient wood. Still, the house was my best option, so I made my way toward it as the heavens began to open up. As I'd seen on other properties in the area, this house had a small cemetery in the yard. I ran toward the gaping front door of the dilapidated house, carefully making my way between the headstones. When lightning flashed, I was able to make out the name Kalakak on several of the headstones which the elements hadn't completely erased. When I got inside, the floor was spongy but felt solid enough to hold my weight. I took off my pack and set it near the door, caught my breath, and had a look around. The hinges of the front door had long since rusted away, but I was able to fit the door back into the opening enough to hopefully keep the wind and rain out. At one end of the room, there was a stone fireplace and chimney which was solidly constructed, but I had no wood for a fire. Next to the fireplace was a stairwell full of rubble and cobwebs. I didn't dare apply my weight to those steps, as many had rotted to nothing under their own pitiful weight. Opposite the front door was an opening to an old kitchen of sorts, but when I tried to approach it, my foot went clean through the floor and I decided to stay put until the storm blew over. The remains of the upper floor did an adequate job of keeping the ground floor dry, and I was able to arrange my sleeping bag so that very little water draining from the upper floors managed to land on it. I got out my harmonica and played for a few minutes, then stopped, apprehensive. I didn't know what I was afraid of, but something had chilled me to my core. Outside, the storm continued to build in intensity. My eyes were focused on that stairwell, seeing nothing in darkness and flash-blinded when lightning struck. I must have fallen asleep at some point because suddenly I came to with a searing pain in my neck from leaning my head against the wall for so long. Outside, the storm continued to pound down its fury upon earth. As I sat there rubbing my neck, I began to chuckle to myself for getting wrapped up in the superstition of the area. When I heard it. At first, I heard indiscriminate movement upstairs in the ruins of the upper 2 floors. I was just about to write it off as rats when suddenly it stopped. I froze in place, daring only to move my eyes, and even then just barely. After 30 seconds of paralytic fear, I smiled at myself again and was just about to settle into my sleeping bag when I looked toward the stairs. At the top of the doorway were a pair of glowing red orbs, staring directly at me. Very slowly, they closed down to horizontal slits, then opened up again, wider than before. I can't tell you how long I sat there staring at it, staring at me. It could have been seconds or even hours. And eventually my lower-level self-preservation skills began to kick in, and subconsciously, I started reaching for the knife on my belt. Our eyes locked. My hand progressed inch by inch towards my only means of defending myself. Neither of us blinked for what felt like hours, and while the storm raged on. I prayed for another lightning strike, so that I might catch even a glimpse of my adversary. But despite the ferocity of the rain, the darkness was absolute. When at last my hand reassuringly touched the hilt of my knife, it seemed as if the very fabric of existence was ripped to shreds. The creature began bellowing in the most unearthly, mind-numbing shriek I had ever heard. Knowing I had only one chance and one fluid motion, I released the snap that held my knife in place and released an inside overhand throw that I had practiced during my years of misspent adolescence. I heard a sickening wet thunk, and the shrieking increased in volume 100-fold. As I smashed the rotten door to pieces, I heard the creature flapping against the wall and screaming. Just as I wrenched the remains of the door open, a great flash of lightning struck, and all around the house I saw piles of bones, feathers, and fur. I ran as I had never run before or since. I ran until my veins pumped acid and my limbs were stone. I couldn't see where I was going, but I could follow the dirt roads by the sounds of the sugar sand slurping roadside debris into the ditches. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. When the sun finally rose, I collapsed in the road, heaving, oblivious to the downpour. I awoke with a startle to the sound of a car horn blaring inches from my head. I leapt to my feet and spun around to see the old man from yesterday, holding his sides with laughter. When I opened my mouth to speak, he motioned with his thumb to the back of his truck. I climbed without a word and he began to drive. The events of the previous night began to replay themselves in my head. What had just happened? No matter how many times I considered what I saw, none of it made any sense. As we drove, I realized how far I had run in the dark. It must have been nearly 10 miles. I was angry with myself for being so terrified by a dream, and that's the only thing it could have been. Approached from this angle, everything fit into place. I'd experienced a false awakening as so many times in the past when experimenting with dream herbs. I had a nightmare and woke up with adrenaline pumping and abandoned all of my gear in an old house. I suddenly realized that the truck had sat motionless for quite some time and the old man was turned around in his seat staring at me. I looked up at him and he grinned. With sickening horror, I realized that we were at the bottom of the hill on which that wretched house sat. I jumped out of the pickup and thanked the old man who drove off. I slowly walked up the muddy path that led to the house, composing myself. When I reached the yard, I saw the old piles of bones which had shocked me the previous night during the storm. Of course, there were coyotes and foxes in the area, and I had hunted a couple of wild turkeys. The critters probably had their dens around here and had been using the house as a windbreak. Inside the house, everything appeared as I had left it. My sleeping bag, my pack, and my harmonica was sitting on the floor, and I could see my knife sticking out of the wall across the room. I packed everything up and put on my backpack, then walked over to the stairs and pulled my knife out of the wall. I was about to return it to the sheath on my belt when I looked at the blade and noticed the dried-on blood and the clump of oily black hair stuck to it. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. A couple of years ago, I spent the summer fighting wildfires in southern Oregon. My crew was on a particularly large fire, and an unfortunate series of events landed us on night shift. On one of those nights, we were posted up near the top of a ridge as the fire was burning slowly up towards us from a valley below. The fire was a good half-mile away, so there wasn't much for us to do besides wait. We broke into 2 groups and spread out over a large stretch of road and hunkered down for the night. My partner got bored of sitting around, so he decided to hike over and check in on the groups on either side of us. The next thing I remember is waking up at the start. It was dead quiet and the air was incredibly still. Some thick smoke had settled in around us and was messing with the bright moonlight. It's hard to describe. The light was bouncing around the smoke as it appeared relatively bright. But it was smoke, so you still can't see more than 10 to 20 feet in front of you. Anyways, I woke up in this dead silent, still, eerie night. And I immediately knew something was wrong, but I couldn't quite place it. I tried, but I couldn't get myself to relax. I was looking around, trying to peer through the smoke at anything that could have woken me up. About 30 seconds after waking up, I heard a stick snapping nearby. Instant sphincter clencher. I sat straight up, switched on my headlamp to try and look around. Of course, the headlamp didn't do much to illuminate anything besides smoke. After a couple of minutes of frantically looking around and not seeing or hearing anything, I started to relax a bit and switched off my headlamp and leaned back. At this point, I was starting to think that the setting was too perfect for my crew to not be messing with me. Besides, animals don't like smoke, so they usually aren't around fires. I was about to start laughing at myself for being so jumpy over nothing and yelling that they weren't going to scare me this time. But just then, I heard another crack. A lot closer this time and about 20 feet away. I instantly knew this wasn't anyone in the crew. It was too silent that night for anyone to be able to sneak up on me like that, especially as freaked out as I was a couple of minutes ago trying to find the source of the initial stick breaking. I jumped right up, tool in hand, and looked in the direction of the snap. And then I saw it, about 20 feet away. A silhouette. Easily distinguishable from the trees. There were no branches on the silhouette, and not to mention that it wasn't there in my previous scans. What I did see, though, was a definite head sitting on top of a neck on top of broad shoulders, standing extremely tall with what looked like big eyes that were glinting a bit from the moonlight. Needless to say, I turned and hightailed it back to the road and then down the road until I found some other people from my crew. I talked to the people who were around me, and none of them saw or heard anything the rest of the night or any other night that we were on top of that ridge. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't human, and it absolutely scared me. I worked at Keystone Resort in Colorado for a few years. During the summers, we would set up conferences, weddings, and things of that nature. A number of weddings were performed at one of the mountaintop buildings that would be high-end dining cafeterias in the winter and functions in the summer. Imagine mountaintop, beautiful buildings with huge stone fireplaces and magnificent vistas off huge wooden decks. Nice places for weddings if you can afford it. Anyway, to get to these places required driving along dirt roads that would snake through valleys and then up switchback roads along the mountain until you reached the top and the building in question. It was approximately 8 miles of winding mountain roads. One night, we had a quick turnaround from a conference into a wedding the following afternoon. This required moving lots of tables and chairs out and down the mountain and moving up different tables and chairs for the wedding. So, we would have a crew breaking down the previous setup and loading a truck, which would then be driven down to a building that had the other equipment unloaded and reloaded by the crew there, and then equipment driven back up the mountain. I was the one driving the truck. So here I am driving the long, twisty 8-mile drive back up the mountain with my last equipment load. I'm about 1.5 miles from my destination, which means that I'm in the middle of the switchbacks that are weaving their way up the mountain. My truck coughs a few times and then shuts off. I try to restart it, but I get nothing. At this point, I'm angry. I have no radio, and now I have to hoof it to the mountaintop building to radio down for another truck. I get out and start walking. I get about 100 yards and I hear something off in the woods. A kind of heavy footfall and some brush snapping. I freeze. The darkness is darn near absolute, and this road has no lighting at all, just the little light coming from about a quarter moon. that familiar shiver shoots straight from my lower back right to the top of my head. I'm straining to hear anything at all, but I don't hear anything. I start to walk again, trying to walk very softly, and my head keeps moving back and forth, trying to catch any slight sound. I get about another 25 yards, and the movement in the woods starts up again, sort of shadowing me from uphill and behind me. There are tingles all through my body. My eyes are like dinner plates, and my breath is coming in big gasps. I stop and try to look for any movement, and the movement in the woods stops again. My brain is telling me, don't worry, it's a deer or an elk or maybe a bear. My subconscious is screaming, Bigfoot. I'm trying to maintain my calm, but calm has left the building. I start walking very fast, trying to discern any sounds from behind me. It doesn't take long. The footfalls in the brush being moved through starts up again as I'm moving. And that was all she wrote for me. I haul off, running hell-bent on reaching the building and safety before I'm slaughtered by the unknown. I hear crashing in the underbrush for about 15 or 20 seconds. After that, all I can hear is the pounding of my blood in my head and the jolting thuds of my own feet hitting the ground. I have no idea how fast I ran that last mile and a half to the building. I was sure that at any moment something was going to grab me out of the darkness. I made it to the safety of the building and dashed inside. Everyone there took one look at me and then sat me down and gave me a big drink from the bar. I must have been white as a ghost. My buddies gave me plenty of crap for being scared, but none of them set foot outside to check out my story. They just radioed for another truck to come and get the stuff out of my broken down vehicle and deliver it the rest of the way. I finished up my shift and got cross-eyed drunk that morning and the next day. I'd never been so scared in the woods in my life. And in case you couldn't tell, I'm not an outdoorsy type. I don't hunt or camp. I have no idea what was in the woods that night. My rational side says it was just a big animal, but my paranoia tells me it was something else. I never saw anything, I just heard the noise and it chasing me. And to this day I still think it was probably just an elk or a bear. But try telling that to yourself when you're all alone in the pitch black woods. I don't know why people make up these skinwalker stories. The things animals do in the wild are often much more terrifying. I work primarily as a hiking guide in northern West Virginia. It's very beautiful and there's a wide variety of trails that people love to walk on, and it's a dream job that I love to do myself. This story happened a few years ago in the spring of 2019. I was leading a group of 4. 2 of them were veterans apparently on some type of PTSD therapy retreat, and the other 2 were a middle-aged dad and his kid who I think was about 13 or so. I only work from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., but due to a scheduling error, this hike was a lot earlier than I'm used to at 6 a.m. I was wide awake and it wasn't pitch black out, so I know the story isn't the result of sleep deprivation or seeing the shadows move. We had gotten halfway through the trail. It was quite a short one, and we were taking a break because the kid tripped and got his knee hurt. One of the veterans was looking over it, making sure that he was fine, and I was looking out into the woods, waiting for them to wrap up. It was about 7:30 in the morning, and if I recall correctly, it was a bit hard to see into the denser part of the woods. But I saw a coyote very slowly approach us out of the woods and near the trail. Coyotes are usually spooked off by groups larger than 3, and I was expecting it to scamper. But I noticed pretty quickly, though, that it seemed to be very injured. One of its hind legs had been gnawed down to the bone. I didn't get a clear look, but it was like it had been degloved, aside from a few parts clinging to it. The coyote looked very haggard too, like it was tired and probably sick. I kind of felt bad for it and went to grab my phone so I could report it to one of the local rangers that there was a sick or at least wounded coyote out here. Its injuries didn't look like they were caused by anything natural, like infections or bites. And all of a sudden, that's when this massive buck bounded out from the woods. Now I was at a distance from all of this, but from my estimation, this thing would have easily towered over me and even one of the veterans, who was a 6'6" brick house. I instinctively backed up, knowing not to mess around with this thing or anything in its path, and I just watched as it started to bash on the coyote. It stomped it into the dirt and completely mutilated its corpse. It kept ramming its antlers into the coyote and rending backwards until the poor thing was just ripped apart. It looked up after it was done and casually walked back into the woods like it didn't absolutely massacre a predator. I don't know if the kid or parents saw it, but the veteran eventually commented on how terrifying moose are, and I simply nodded my head. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations that come out, and they'll come out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the comma.